The sky over the Pacific looked calm that morning, blue, endless, almost forgiving, and that was the danger, because high above the waves, Japanese fighter pilots believed they had already won this war in the air. They looked down at the American F4F Wildcats below them, slow, clumsy, outdated, and smiled behind their oxygen masks. This was going to be easy. What they didn't know was that, hidden inside those lumbering American fighters, was an idea that would change aerial combat forever. An idea that would turn confidence into panic and hunters into the hunted. If you enjoy deeply human war stories like this, consider subscribing. In early 1942, the Pacific War was tilting sharply in Japan's favor. Pearl Harbor was still fresh in American memory, its wreckage smoldering not just in Hawaii, but in the national psyche. Across Southeast Asia, Japanese forces advanced with breathtaking speed, and in the air, the symbol of that dominance was the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero was everything a fighter pilot dreamed of: light, fast, beautifully responsive. It could outclimb, outturn, and outrun almost anything the Allies could throw against it. Japanese naval aviators, many of them veterans of brutal pre-war training, flew it with a near-mythical confidence. They had earned that arrogance in combat over China, where they faced opponents who never truly challenged them. Across the Pacific, American pilots were flying the Grumman F4F Wildcat. On paper, it looked like a relic, slower than the Zero, heavier, less agile. Its cockpit felt cramped, its controls were stiff. No one who flew it believed it was superior, but the Wildcat had something else: thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a brutal ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. One man understood that this difference mattered. Lieutenant Commander John Thach wasn't flashy. He wasn't a daredevil ace. He was thoughtful, analytical, the kind of officer who worried in silence. Thatch had studied reports coming back from the Pacific and saw the pattern clearly. One-on-one dogfights against Zeros was suicide. American pilots were dying because they were trying to fight the wrong war using the wrong instincts. So Thatch asked a dangerous question: what if individual skill didn't matter as much as teamwork? Back in the United States, long before his ideas were tested in blood, Thatch began experimenting in the air with fellow pilots. He sketched diagrams on notepads, two fighters flying side by side. When an enemy dove on one, both would turn inward, crossing paths. If the attacker followed, he'd drift directly into the guns of the other plane. Simple, elegant, relentless. They called it the Thach Weave. At first, it sounded too basic, almost naive. Could coordination really defeat speed and agility? Could discipline replace raw performance? Even Thatch didn't know for sure, but he knew the alternative, continuing to fight alone, would end in disaster. By mid-1942, the Pacific had reached a boiling point. Japanese carriers roamed aggressively. American task forces, stretched thin, knew they would eventually be forced into a decisive confrontation. The pressure on pilots was suffocating. Every takeoff might be the last. Every mistake was fatal. Moments like this changed history. Hit like, so this story reaches more people. When the two forces finally clashed in the skis, Japanese pilots entered the fight with familiar confidence. They spotted Wildcats below and dove eagerly, certain of another swift kill. The first passes went as expected, Zeros streaking downward, tracers flashing, Wildcats rolling hard under attack. Then something felt wrong. Instead of breaking apart, the American fighters stayed together. They turned toward each other. The Japanese pilots followed instinctively, locked onto their targets, and suddenly, the geometry of the sky betrayed them. A Zero pursuing one Wildcat found another Wildcat crossing directly into its path. Guns flared. The Zero lurched. Another Japanese fighter tried to disengage, only to be forced into the same deadly crossing pattern. The weave tightened. The air filled with confusion, overlapping turns, and panicked calls over Japanese radios. This wasn't how air combat was supposed to work. For the first time, Japanese pilots realized they were no longer dictating the fight. Their beloved Zero, so lethal in isolation, was vulnerable when teamwork replaced individual heroics. Its light frame, once an advantage, offered little protection against concentrated fire. Pilots who had never needed to fear being hit now felt the shock of bullets tearing through wings and fuel lines. Inside the Wildcat cockpits, American pilots felt it too, the shift, the sudden understanding that they could survive, that they could fight back, that the enemy could bleed. The Thach Weave didn't make the Wildcat faster, it didn't make it turn tighter, but it did something far more powerful. It forced the Zero to fight on American terms. When the battle ended, the sky was quieter, smoke drifted downward, survivors returned to their carriers changed men, Japanese commanders studied the losses in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Their pilots were elite, their aircraft superior, and yet something intangible had slipped away. Confidence. The implications rippled outward. The myth of Japanese aerial invincibility cracked. American pilots began training aggressively in cooperative tactics. Doctrines shifted. Engagements grew more disciplined, more lethal. The Zero would remain dangerous, but it was no longer untouchable. And for Japan, the loss was more than aircraft. It was psychological, a realization that this war would not be decided by elegance alone, that adaptability, not arrogance, would shape the future of the skis. Share this story with someone who thinks WWII outcomes were inevitable. Because up there, in that blue Pacific sky, history didn't change because of a new machine. It changed because one man refused to accept defeat as destiny and taught others to trust each other when the odds said they shouldn't. In the weeks that followed, the battles blurred together. Names like Coral Sea and Midway whispered across briefing rooms and carrier decks, but the lesson of the Thach Weave lingered in every American pilot's mind. It was no longer about winning a duel. It was about surviving long enough to win a war. Japanese pilots noticed the change immediately. Encounters that once felt predictable now felt chaotic. Wildcats no longer scattered when attacked. They moved with intent. Zeros diving from altitude found fewer isolated targets, fewer easy victories. And when Japanese pilots pressed harder, relying on instinct and aggression, they paid for it. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, explanations came slowly and often reluctantly. The Zero was still considered a masterpiece. Losses were blamed on bad luck, on pilot error, on circumstance. Few wanted to admit that doctrine itself might be flawed. After all, Japanese air combat philosophy prized individual excellence, the lone warrior's skill, the decisive maneuver. Teamwork existed, but it was secondary to personal mastery. That mindset was now working against them. The Thach Weave forced Japanese pilots into a choice they hated: break off the attack and abandon the kill, or stay committed and risk flying straight into a trap. Either way, the psychological balance had shifted. Air combat was no longer a clean contest of reflexes. It was a chessboard, and the Americans were thinking several moves ahead. For John Thach, the success of his idea brought no celebration. He watched the casualty lists grow. He listened to debriefings filled with exhaustion and quiet relief. The Weave worked, but it did not make war any less brutal. Friends were still lost. Planes still burned. The difference was that now there was a fighting chance. As the war pushed deeper into 1942, the consequences became impossible to ignore. At Midway, Japanese carrier air groups, once the sharpest blade in the Pacific, were shattered. Pilots who survived spoke of confusion in the air, of Americans who refused to fight alone, of Zeros that suddenly felt fragile. The loss of experienced aviators hurt more than the loss of ships. Training new pilots took time Japan did not have. American forces, by contrast, absorbed lessons quickly. The Wildcat's successors, the Hellcat and Corsair, would eventually surpass the Zero in raw performance, but those aircraft inherited something even more important than speed or firepower. They inherited doctrine, coordination, mutual protection, the understanding that survival depended on the man flying beside you. In later years, some Japanese veterans admitted the truth in quiet interviews. The Americans had learned faster, they adapted, they questioned assumptions, and once the Zero's myth was broken, it never fully returned. The Thach Weave spread beyond the Pacific. It influenced training manuals, shaped air combat theory, and became a foundation for modern fighter tactics. Variations of it would appear again and again, refined but recognizable, wherever pilots faced enemies with different strengths. Yet at its core, the idea remained disarmingly human. Two pilots, trusting each other completely, turning toward danger instead of away from it. For the men who flew those early Wildcats, the memory never faded. They remembered the sound of engines straining in tight turns, the moment of fear as a Zero filled the canopy, the instant when crossing paths meant the difference between life and death. They remembered realizing, mid-fight, that they were no longer helpless. And for Japanese pilots, many of whom had entered the war believing themselves invincible, that realization cut just as deeply. Skill alone was not enough. Courage alone was not enough. The sky no longer belonged to any one nation. The Thach Weave did not end the Pacific War, but it marked a turning point, subtle, easily overlooked, yet decisive. It proved that wars are not won only by superior machines or daring individuals. They are won by those willing to rethink, to adapt, and to place faith in collective strength when tradition says otherwise. In the vast silence above the ocean, where seconds determined survival, arrogance fell away. What remained was cooperation and the understanding that history can pivot on something as simple as two aircraft turning toward each other at exactly the right moment. Long after the smoke of those early battles drifted away, the men who survived carried the weight of what they'd learned. American pilots spoke less about speed and more about spacing, less about heroics and more about trust. Briefings changed tone. The Wildcat was no longer introduced with apology, but with respect, an aircraft that had demanded something from its pilots in return for keeping them alive. John Thach would later reflect that the Weave was never meant to be a secret weapon. It was a reminder that war punishes those who cling too tightly to yesterday's victories, that confidence, when left unexamined, becomes a liability, and that intelligence, quiet, adaptive, collective, often outlasts brilliance. For Japan, the cost was irreversible. Their early war pilots had been the product of years of elite training, a small brotherhood sharpened to perfection. When they fell, they could not be replaced quickly. New pilots arrived with fewer hours, less experience, and a growing sense that the sky itself had become hostile. They flew the same Zero, but it no longer felt like an extension of their will. It felt exposed. As American industry surged and new fighters filled carrier decks, the imbalance widened. But even as technology turned the tide, veterans knew the truth. The moment the war in the air truly shifted was not when a faster plane arrived. It was when a slower one refused to fight alone. In later decades, aviation historians would analyze diagrams and performance charts. They would debate turning radii and climb rates. But the men who were there remembered something else entirely: the shock in an enemy's movements, the hesitation where certainty once lived, the fleeting glance of a Zero sliding helplessly across a gun sight it never expected to see. The Thach Weave endured because it captured something timeless about conflict, that superiority is never permanent, that adaptability beats tradition, and that arrogance, no matter how justified it once seemed, eventually meets a moment it cannot survive. High above the Pacific, where the horizon dissolved into blue and the margin for error was measured in heartbeats, that lesson was written in contrails and falling aircraft. It was written by pilots who trusted one another more than their machines, and by opponents who learned, too late, that dominance in war is not a possession, but a condition that must be earned again every single day. The Wildcats flew on, the Zeros kept coming, but the sky was no longer the same. Years later, when the war was finally over and the Pacific grew quiet again, survivors from both sides tried to explain what had really happened in those early months. They spoke in different languages, wore different uniforms, and carried different memories, but the theme was the same. Something invisible had shifted in the air. For American pilots, the Thach Weave became more than a tactic. It became a mindset. Young aviators arriving fresh from training were taught from day one that survival depended on the man flying beside them. Lone wolves did not last long. Discipline mattered. Formation mattered. Looking out for someone else often meant staying alive yourself. Carrier decks echoed with stories, some whispered, Some laughed about to hide the fear of moments when a wingman's guns had saved a life by mere seconds. Those stories traveled faster than official manuals. They became part of the culture of American naval aviation, shaping how pilots thought, how they fought, and how they coped with the constant nearness of death. John Thach never claimed credit the way legends often do. He remained reserved, even uncomfortable with praise. When asked about the Weave, he spoke less about brilliance and more about necessity. He understood something fundamental. When faced with an enemy who appears superior, pride must be set aside. The only unforgivable mistake is refusing to adapt. That humility stood in stark contrast to the culture across the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war believing its pilots were the finest in the world, and in many ways they were. Their training emphasized instinct, aggression, and mastery of the aircraft, but it also carried an unspoken assumption that superiority, once achieved, would endure. Doctrine evolved slowly. Losses were rationalized rather than dissected. By the time meaningful changes were considered, the pool of experienced pilots had already been drained. Veterans later admitted that the Zero, for all its elegance, had trapped them psychologically. It rewarded boldness so completely in the early war that it discouraged caution. When American pilots refused to play by those rules, when they stayed together, absorbed damage, and turned defense into offense, the Zero's strengths no longer guaranteed survival. By 1943, the skies over the Pacific told a different story. American formations moved with confidence. New aircraft arrived with heavier armor, more firepower, and tactics refined through brutal experience. Japanese pilots, increasingly young and undertrained, faced enemies who no longer feared them. The balance had tipped, not with a single dramatic moment, but with an accumulation of lessons learned faster by one side than the other. And yet, even as victory became more likely, American pilots never forgot how close it had once been. The early days, when Wildcats clawed desperately for survival against seemingly unbeatable foes, remained etched into memory. They understood that history could have gone another way, that without adaptation, without cooperation, courage alone would not have been enough. The Thach Weave lived on beyond WWII. Its principles, mutual support, overlapping fields of fire, disciplined maneuver, found their way into jet combat, into modern air forces, into doctrines taught generations later. Technology changed, speeds increased, missiles replaced machine guns, but the core idea remained unchanged. Never fight alone if you can fight together. In interviews recorded decades later, elderly pilots paused when asked about those early encounters. Their voices softened, some smiled faintly, others stared into the distance. They remembered the sound of wind over wings, the sudden violence of combat, the relief of seeing a friendly aircraft slide into position exactly where it was supposed to be. For Japanese veterans, reflection came with regret but also respect. Many acknowledged the Americans' willingness to learn, to discard assumptions, to value collective survival over individual glory. They recognized, in hindsight, that wars are rarely lost in a single defeat, but often in the refusal to change. In the end, the story of the Wildcat and the Zero is not just about airplanes. It is about people, about belief and doubt, about how quickly confidence can become complacency and how quickly desperation can become innovation. High above the Pacific, amid clouds that never remembered the names of the fallen, a simple idea proved decisive. Two aircraft, turning inward, trusting each other completely. In that moment, the sky stopped belonging to the fastest or the most agile and began belonging to those who understood that survival, like history itself, is a shared endeavor. The Japanese pilots had dismissed the Wildcat as slow. They were right on paper, but paper does not fight wars, people do. And when teamwork met arrogance in the open sky, the outcome was written not by speed, but by adaptation. That was the true turning point, not when the Zero was finally outclassed, but when it was finally understood.